At 1 minute past midnight on a Saturday in late August, trucks lined up at the Peace Bridge between Ontario and New York found themselves on the wrong side of history. In that single minute, a 50% tariff kicked in on billions of dollars of Canadian goods headed south: wine, cement, dairy, hockey sticks, cars, and a trade relationship that has functioned, with occasional friction, for more than 3 decades effectively broken half. Prime Minister Mark Carney had just done something no Canadian leader has done in the modern era of North American trade. He looked at the final terms on the table and walked away. This is the story of how that moment came to be, what it means for the roughly $1 billion a day in goods that normally cross this border, and why officials in Washington and Ottawa are still arguing, even now, about who actually blew up the deal. To understand why a Saturday morning press conference in Ottawa became one of the most consequential trade moments of the year, you have to go back to the tool the Trump administration reached for in the first place, because it wasn't one of the usual ones. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations invoking a provision of law called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. If that sounds obscure, that's because it is. Section 338 is part of the same legislative package that produced the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, the ones historians widely blame for deepening the Great Depression. According to research from the trade monitoring group Global Trade Alert, no American president had ever used Section 338 to actually impose a tariff. The last time the U.S. government even referenced the statute in an official capacity was a 1949 State Department telegram about trade friction with China. For nearly 80 years, it sat completely unused on the books. So why dust off a Depression-era statute now? Context matters here, and this is where the older layer of this story connects to the newer one. Earlier in 2026, the Supreme Court had struck down Trump's use of a different legal tool, emergency powers legislation, that the administration had been leaning on to justify a wide swath of its second-term tariff agenda. Bloomberg reported that with that emergency powers route closed off, the administration turned to Section 338 as an alternative source of authority, one that, unlike other tariff mechanisms, requires no investigation, no hearing, and no formal agency report before the president can act. The White House's own fact sheet on the move stated plainly that the goal was to offset what it called Canada's discriminatory treatment of American exports in 3 specific sectors: motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer laid out the administration's case in a formal statement, saying Canada had pulled American alcohol off store shelves in several provinces, given European dairy exporters better market access than their American counterparts, and capped how many vehicles could be imported duty-free from companies that had moved production back to the United States. Ottawa, in the administration's telling, was punishing the very companies that had responded to Trump's reshoring push by returning jobs to American soil. The tariffs themselves were sweeping. Each of the 3 proclamations imposed a 50% additional duty on a different basket of Canadian goods. And crucially, according to the White House fact sheet, these tariffs applied regardless of whether the products were compliant with the existing North American trade agreement known as USMCA. That detail matters enormously because USMCA, the pact Trump himself negotiated and signed during his first term, was supposed to guarantee duty-free treatment for qualifying goods. Section 338 simply overrode that protection. Energy, potash, critical minerals, and goods already covered by separate steel and aluminum tariffs were carved out, but everything else, from fishing rods to flower bulbs to cosmetics, was fair game under the 2 lengthy product annexes attached to the proclamations. Legal analysts immediately flagged the move as controversial. A review published by the National Law Review noted that Section 338 also contains an embargo power. If the president determines that discrimination continues or worsens, he can exclude a country's products from the U.S. market entirely, backed by the forfeiture of any goods brought in violation of that embargo. Nobody had ever seen that power tested either. Writing for the Independent Institute, one research fellow with a doctorate in economics from George Mason University argued the entire exercise was, in his words, a trade fight with no winner, since the auto tariffs Canada had imposed were themselves a direct response to tariffs the United States had put in place first. That critique captures something important about this story. Almost every retaliatory step on both sides of the border can be traced back to an earlier retaliatory step on the other side, in a cycle that by August 2026 had been running for well over a year. The 30-day clock that Section 338 requires before tariffs take effect meant the new duties were set to land on August 19th. That gave both governments a narrow window to either strike a deal or let the tariffs hit. And for a few days in mid-August, it genuinely looked like they might avoid it. Here's where the newest layer of the story becomes just as important as the background. On the Tuesday before the deadline, with the 50% tariffs just hours from taking effect, President Trump posted on Truth Social that the tariffs were being paused for 3 days. His reasoning, in his own words, was that Canada and the United States, quote, have a deal. CNBC reported that Trump even floated reviving the long-dormant Keystone XL pipeline project as part of the warming mood between the two governments. For a moment, it seemed the standoff that had defined so much of the year was about to end with a handshake instead of a tariff. It did not happen. According to CNBC's reporting, Canada's Trade Minister for the United States, Dominic LeBlanc, told journalists on the Thursday before the deadline that the deal was, in his words, very close. Officials on both sides, according to NBC News, seemed genuinely optimistic right up until the final hours. And then, late on Friday night, it all came apart. United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer posted on social media early Saturday morning that Canada had, in his account, declined to finalize the trade deal under terms both sides had reportedly agreed to earlier in the week. Bloomberg reported that same allegation from Greer's post. Canada's version of events, delivered by Prime Minister Carney in a statement posted to social media, was the mirror opposite. He said it was the United States that had introduced unfair, last-minute changes to the proposed terms, and that those changes were what forced him to suspend the talks. Axios described this as one side blaming the other almost in real time, with neither government backing down from its account of who moved the goalposts. Whatever the exact sequence, the outcome was not in dispute. The 50% tariffs, covering roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, August 22nd. Fox Business reported the figure slightly higher, closer to $28 billion once the full scope of the covered goods was accounted for. Either way, this was one of the largest single tariff actions the two countries had exchanged since the trade dispute began. By Saturday morning, Prime Minister Carney was in front of cameras in Ottawa, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the language he chose was unusually direct for a head of government who has generally favored careful, measured public statements. Speaking at a news conference in the Canadian capital, Carney told reporters, according to CNN's reporting, "In recent days, the United States proposed new terms that were uneconomic, unfair, and undermined the net benefits for Canada, and called into question the reliability of any deal." He summarized his read on the American offer in a single blunt line that multiple outlets, including CNN and NBC News, captured nearly identically. In short, they asked too much, and they offered too little. When a reporter in Ottawa asked Carney why it felt like he was, in the reporter's words, going to war, Carney's response, as reported by NBC News, was even sharper. Because we were attacked. That is not the language of a leader trying to keep a door open. It's the language of a government drawing a line. Carney went further at a separate briefing covered by CBC News, framing the entire episode as a choice between two bad options and picking the one he considered less damaging. He told Canadians the government was walking away from what he called a bad deal, and he laid out what comes next, dollar-for-dollar retaliation. According to CNN and the Associated Press, as relayed through Axios, Carney announced that Canadian countermeasures would take effect on September 8th, targeting a specific list of American goods: dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp, paper, and electronics. It's worth noting that Carney did not simply announce blanket retaliation. Axios reported that Canada would match the American tariffs, in Carney's own phrase, dollar for dollar, a deliberate signal that Ottawa intended proportionate response rather than escalation for its own sake. There's an important piece of context that's easy to miss in the noise of the collapse. Canada had not walked into these negotiations empty-handed. CNN reported that Canada had already offered real concessions as part of the proposed deal, removing retaliatory measures it had put in place the previous year and allowing American alcohol back onto Canadian store shelves. Those were genuine, substantive offers. But according to Carney's own account, the United States did not reciprocate with what he considered sensible terms for core industries, particularly automotives. And on the question of critical minerals, a sector where Canada holds significant global leverage, Carney told reporters, as reported by CNN, that Canada would never grant the United States what he called exclusive access. That single sticking point, according to people close to the talks, may have been as important as any tariff line item in the collapse. President Trump's public response came the following morning, and it was delivered in his characteristic style, a truth social post rather than a formal statement. According to CNN's reporting, Trump wrote, "Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one." He also claimed in the same post that Canada had for years charged American farmers what he called massive tariffs, adding, "No more." The White House, for its part, did not immediately respond to formal requests for comment from either CNN or NBC News following Carney's Saturday remarks. That silence itself became part of the story. A report from the political commentary outlet The Last Refuge noted that while Carney was giving speeches and holding press conferences to explain his position, Trump and his trade team had gone conspicuously quiet, a contrast the report framed as a deliberate negotiating posture. describing high-stakes negotiators as typically preferring to let their actions, not their words, make the next move. Now, why does a trade dispute between two G7 allies matter beyond the price of Canadian wine and lumber? Because of the sheer scale of what's actually at stake. According to U.S. Census data cited by Axios, trade between the United States and Canada totaled $376 billion in just the first half of 2026 alone, a figure that put Canada as the second largest U.S. trading partner, behind only Mexico and roughly double the trade volume with China. This is not a peripheral relationship. It's one of the largest bilateral trading partnerships on the planet, built over decades of integrated supply chains, particularly in autos, energy, and agriculture. The economic analysis on what this collapse actually costs is still being worked out, but early estimates paint a serious picture. CBC News cited Trevor Tome, an economist at the University of Calgary, who estimated that as many as 90,000 Canadian jobs could be affected by the new round of tariffs. That's not a hypothetical number pulled from a press release. It's an independent academic estimate of real economic disruption tied directly to this failed negotiation. The political fallout inside Canada has been just as significant as the economic fallout. Bloomberg spoke with Chrystia Freeland, Canada's former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, who offered a striking historical framing. She said Carney was doing something no previous Canadian Prime Minister had done, accepting even implicitly that the President of the United States can impose tariffs on Canadian goods despite the terms of the existing North American trade agreement. Freeland pointed out that under the terms being discussed before the collapse, Canada would apparently have accepted lower tariffs on steel, aluminum, cars, and car parts, while still formally recognizing that some tariffs would remain in place. That's a real Rubicon that it looks like will be crossed, she said, according to Bloomberg's reporting. A comment that lands differently now that the deal in question never actually got signed and instead collapsed into open retaliation. CBC News also spoke with Steve Verhoeven, Canada's former chief trade negotiator, who was reportedly concerned even before the final collapse that Canada had been giving up too much ground in the negotiations. That's a notable detail, because it suggests the deal falling apart wasn't purely a story of American overreach. Some Canadian trade veterans were uneasy about the direction talks were heading, even while they were still ongoing. Zooming out, this episode is being read in Washington policy circles as more than just a bilateral dispute. It's being read as a test case for President Trump's broader approach to trade. The Washington Post's analysis, published the day after the collapse, framed it starkly. The newspaper described the breakdown as, in the words of one unnamed analyst quoted in the piece, a big setback, and noted that other countries currently unhappy with the terms of their own trade arrangements with the United States are almost certainly watching how this plays out. The Post's broader argument is that Trump's approach, using an untested legal power to try to force a G7 ally to accept a lengthening list of American demands, ran into a wall when Carney simply refused to sign. Whether that becomes a template for other trading partners considering their own pushback, or an isolated case tied specifically to the Canada relationship, is something analysts are still debating. The research organization CSIS offered a slightly different read on the administration's strategic thinking back when the Section 338 tariffs were first announced in July. Their analysis suggested the timing wasn't random. It came as U.S. negotiations with Mexico over a renewed USMCA were reportedly moving quickly, while talks with Canada had lagged behind. CSIS's analysis proposed that threatening Canada with an unprecedented tariff tool served three purposes at once: building negotiating leverage, pushing Ottawa to formally join broader USMCA review talks it had been slow to engage with, and sending a message to other countries. Brazil was mentioned specifically, given its own tariff dispute with Washington at the time, that retaliating against U.S. trade actions carries a cost. If that was the strategic logic, the collapse of talks in Ottawa this past weekend represents, at minimum, a stumble in executing it. To really appreciate how unusual this moment is, it helps to remember where the U.S.-Canada trade war actually began, because it didn't start with Section 338 at all. According to CBC News reporting from 2025, the two countries had already been locked in a running trade dispute since early in Trump's second term, when the administration first imposed border-related tariffs tied to concerns about fentanyl trafficking across the northern border. That initial round was layered on top of separate tariffs on steel and aluminum, and later, a 25% duty on cars and trucks not built on American soil, all imposed under different legal authorities than the one used this past month. CBC's reporting noted that Trump argued those earlier tariffs would boost domestic manufacturing and protect American jobs, while critics warned they would raise prices for U.S. consumers and strain an auto industry that, on both sides of the border, depends on parts crossing the frontier multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly. Canada, for its part, sells roughly 3/4 of everything it exports to the United States, according to BBC reporting from mid-2025, which is part of why so much of Ottawa's economic strategy for well over a year has revolved almost entirely around managing this one relationship. The diplomatic choreography between Carney and Trump has swung between warmth and open confrontation multiple times over the past 16 months, and it's worth tracing that arc briefly because it explains why nobody in either capital was entirely shocked when talks collapsed this past weekend. That deadline passed without an agreement. By July, Carney was telling Canada's premiers directly at a meeting in Huntsville, Ontario, that his government would not sign an agreement just to say a deal existed, insisting Canada was pursuing terms that served, in his words, the country's best interest and nothing less. An August 1st deadline came next, and it too passed without resolution, prompting Trump to tell reporters ahead of a trip to Scotland that the U.S. had not, in his words, had a lot of luck with Canada, and that he suspected the relationship might simply settle into a permanent tariff arrangement rather than a negotiated deal at all. That back and forth matters because it shows this wasn't a sudden rupture between two governments that had barely spoken. These were leaders who had met face-to-face repeatedly, spoken by phone, negotiated through cabinet-level officials for over a year, and still ended up at a 50% tariff wall. It's also worth understanding just how unusual it is for USMCA-compliant goods to lose their protected status at all. The trade agreement, which Trump signed during his first term as a replacement for NAFTA, was specifically designed to guarantee duty-free treatment for goods that meet its rules of origin. Multiple legal analyses, including one from the law firm Holland and Knight, noted that the Section 338 tariffs apply regardless of USMCA compliance, meaning a Canadian-made car that checks every box required under the trade agreement. Trump himself negotiated still faces the full 50% duty. That's an unusual legal position for the administration to take, and it's part of why trade lawyers describe this as genuinely uncharted territory, distinct from the steel, aluminum, and national security tariffs that have driven most of the trade friction between the two countries up to this point. There's a broader arc here too, one that stretches back well before this particular collapse. Carney became Prime Minister in the spring of 2025, and almost from his first weeks in office, the defining question of his government was whether he could manage the relationship with Trump better than his predecessor had. Through the summer of 2025 and into 2026, deadline after deadline passed. An August 1st target, then further extensions, with Carney repeatedly telling premiers and reporters alike that his government would not, in his words, accept a bad deal, regardless of the political cost of prolonging the standoff. That consistency matters for understanding this past weekend. When Carney says he chose no deal over a bad deal, it's not a new position. It's the position he's held publicly for well over a year, and this is the moment he finally had to act on it under maximum pressure, with 50% tariffs literally hours from taking effect. If you're wondering why Carney would risk this kind of economic pain rather than simply sign whatever was on the table, it helps to look at his own explanation, delivered in that same Ottawa press conference. He framed the decision not as a rejection of trade with the United States altogether, but as a refusal to accept terms he believed would permanently disadvantage Canadian industries, particularly the auto sector, which remains deeply intertwined with American manufacturing, and the critical mineral sector, where Canada holds leverage it has been unwilling to simply hand over. According to Radio Canada's reporting on his remarks, Carney used a memorable phrase to describe what Canada had learned about dealing with the current U.S. administration, saying the country had come to realize that Washington's commitments could sometimes feel as though they were, in his words, written in pencil, a pointed reference to the way the deal, announced just days earlier, evaporated within 72 hours. So where does this leave both countries heading into September? On the American side, the 50% Section 338 tariffs are now in effect indefinitely. According to trade compliance analysis from firms including Avalara, unlike some of Trump's earlier tariff actions under emergency powers legislation, Section 338 duties have no built-in expiration date. They can, in theory, remain in place until a new agreement is reached or the administration chooses to lift them unilaterally. On the Canadian side, retaliation is scheduled and dated September 8th, with a defined list of American sectors facing matching duties. Between now and then, there's a narrow window where diplomacy could still, in theory, restart. Negotiators from both governments have gone quiet before and come back to the table before, sometimes within days. What makes this particular collapse different from the earlier missed deadlines throughout the past year is the emotional register both leaders used to describe it. This wasn't framed by either side as a temporary setback or a scheduling problem. Carney used the word attacked. Trump used language suggesting Canada had taken advantage of the United States for years. Neither leader left obvious room for a quick, face-saving reversal, which is part of why analysts across multiple outlets, from CBC's political desk to the Washington Post's economics team, are treating this less like a bump in the road and more like a genuine inflection point in how these two historically close allies do business with each other. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on something that channels covering fast-moving trade stories like this one don't always slow down to do, laying out exactly what's confirmed and what's still contested. Because not everything in this story is settled fact. What's fully verified, from multiple named sources, including the White House, the Office of the U, Hess Trade Representative, Reuters, CNBC, CNN, NBC News, Axios, Bloomberg, and CBC News. Section 338 was invoked on July 20th. It was the first ever use of that tariff authority. The 50% tariffs took effect at midnight on August 22nd, after a 3-day pause failed to produce a signed deal. Carney announced dollar-for-dollar retaliation set for September 8th, and both governments have publicly and directly blamed each other for the breakdown. What remains genuinely contested, and where the reporting from different outlets diverges, is the precise sequence of who changed which terms and when in the final 48 hours. Before the deadline, Ambassador Greer's account, delivered through a social media post and relayed by Bloomberg, and Prime Minister Carney's account, delivered through his own statement and press conference, do not fully agree with each other, and neither government has released the actual negotiating text that would allow an outside observer to determine definitively which version is more accurate. Some of the framing around Canada's earlier retaliatory measures, the specific scope of provincial alcohol restrictions, for instance, also varies somewhat depending on whether you're reading American trade officials' characterization or Canadian government statements, so that's worth treating as a live dispute rather than settled fact. If a story like this, or one that moves this fast, with this much at stake for ordinary workers on both sides of a shared border, is the kind of coverage that actually helps you understand what's happening in the world rather than just reacting to headlines, staying subscribed means you won't miss the moment either government blinks first whenever that happens. Trade stories like this one rarely resolve cleanly in a single news cycle, and the next update, whether it's a surprise phone call between Ottawa and Washington or the actual rollout of Canada's September 8th retaliation, is going to matter just as much as this one did. There's also a human dimension to this story that's easy to lose in the back and forth of official statements and tariff percentages. 90,000 jobs is not an abstract economic modeling output. It represents real people in auto plants, dairy operations, and agricultural equipment manufacturing on both sides of the border, whose livelihoods are now tied to the outcome of negotiations that, as of this recording, have no scheduled resumption date. Small business owners in border communities, from Fort Erie to Buffalo, are the ones absorbing the immediate shock of a 50% duty landing overnight, often on products they've already ordered and can't easily reroute. One trade analyst quoted in CNBC's reporting on the original Section 338 announcement described the tariffs as striking, in his words, at the heart of small business trade, a phrase that captures just how granular the damage from a policy fight like this one can get, well below the level of prime ministers and Truth Social posts. It's also worth remembering that this didn't come out of nowhere. The broader U.S.-Canada tariff dispute has been running for well over a year at this point, predating even Carney's time in office. The relationship has weathered earlier rounds of tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos under Section 232 National Security Authority, a separate legal mechanism from the one used this time. Each round has followed a familiar pattern: an American tariff action, a Canadian retaliatory response, a period of negotiation, and then either a partial resolution or, as happened this weekend, a complete breakdown. What sets this moment apart is the scale, $20 billion in a single action, and the fact that it came after what both sides, for a few days in mid-August, genuinely believed was a finished deal. For businesses and consumers trying to make sense of what happens next, the practical guidance from trade compliance firms has been consistent. Expect volatility, and don't assume the current 50% rate is permanent in either direction. Customs and trade advisory firm Zonos, which tracks tariff implementation for shipping businesses, noted in its guidance that Section 338 proclamations can be suspended, revoked, or amended by the President at any time without requiring congressional action, meaning the rate that took effect this past Saturday could theoretically change again with a single social media post, the same way the original deadline was paused back in mid-August. That unpredictability is, in many ways, the defining feature of trade policy under the current administration, and it's exactly why this story is worth continuing to follow closely rather than treating this weekend's collapse as a final chapter. If you want to actually understand how a decades-old, never-before-used piece of Depression-era law ended up reshaping trade between two of the world's most integrated economies in the space of about 5 weeks, Following along, as this story develops, is going to matter more than catching any single headline in isolation. Because the next chapter, whatever it turns out to be, is going to build directly on everything laid out here. So here's where things stand as of this recording. Section 338, tariffs of 50%, are in effect on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, with no fixed expiration date. Canada's matching retaliation is scheduled for September 8th. Prime Minister Carney has framed his decision as a defense of Canadian sovereignty and long-term national interest, telling Canadians in Ottawa that a bad deal would have cost more in the long run than the pain of no deal at all. President Trump has framed Canada's position as ingratitude toward a relationship he believes has favored Ottawa for years. Both governments say the door to negotiation technically remains open, even as both continue moving forward with tariffs and countermeasures that suggest neither side expects that door to open again soon. What's less clear, and what genuinely remains an open question even among trade experts who've spent their careers studying this exact relationship, is whether this collapse becomes the moment that permanently resets how Canada approaches trade with the United States, or whether it's simply the latest, loudest chapter in a negotiation that eventually finds its way back to the table, the same way earlier deadlines throughout 2025 and 2026 came and went before eventually reopening. That's the story as it stands right now, built entirely on statements, proclamations, and reporting from named officials and outlets rather than speculation about what might happen next. Whichever direction this goes, a quiet reopening of talks in the coming weeks, or a prolonged standoff that reshapes supply chains on both sides of the border for years to come, it's worth watching closely because very few trade disputes between two G7 allies have moved this fast or carried this much weight for ordinary workers who had no seat at either negotiating table. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. Did Mark Carney make the right call by walking away from a deal he considered bad, even knowing it would trigger 50% tariffs and put tens of thousands of jobs at risk in the short term? Or was there a version of compromise on the table that Canada should have taken rather than risk this level of economic disruption? There's a real argument on both sides, and reasonable people watching this same set of facts have landed in very different places. If you've made it this far into a story this dense with detail, you're clearly someone who wants the full picture rather than a headline, and that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Sticking around for what comes next, as this negotiation almost certainly continues to evolve in the weeks ahead, means you'll see how it resolves as it actually happens rather than piecing it together after the fact. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next update as soon as there's something real to report.